mask off. Right. So in this third session this morning, this is a subject, again, that's very dear to my heart. One of the things that I've been doing is speaking to people around the world for research for our next editions, just finding out what's going on, what do they think the next crisis is going to be, how they're feeling and so forth. And the message I'm getting back is, we're tired. Everybody's tired. We've just been through a really prolonged period of acute stress where people have been worried for their, not only for their families, but for their work, for their communities and so forth. And it seems to me that, and it doesn't really matter what discipline you've been in, you're working in, whether it's in government, whether it's in emergency services, whether it's any job, everyone is exhausted and on their knees. And that's something that we have to be very, very aware of. And of course, that isn't to say that the most exhausted people are obviously those who've been on the direct front lines in ICUs and medical care. So I'm really pleased that today we're going to be looking at how some military research and so forth can be transferred, and observations can be transferred into civilian advice and capacities and so forth. So we've got Magdalena here who's going to be talking to us, and hopefully we'll have time for lots of questions afterwards as well, because I think this is a really important human discussion we need to be having. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Good. It's an absolute honor to be here today. Usually when you have an assembly of frontline professionals, you would like to go the other way, right? Usually means that you have a massive crisis going. But today I'm very happy to be here and to be talking to you. My name is Magdalena. I am one of the co-founders of Metis Services. We took the name actually from the Greek goddess of wisdom and cunning, from the Greek mythology. Wisdom and cunning we thought was a good push, because it was both about the what and the how. And this is really what we need when we're working in a crisis. We have been daunted, I think, by this last times. Metis was the advisor to the gods, and now really we've been giving advice to people, professionals, who have made the difference between life and death, who really have been acting gods. There's a big number of you, but there's one person missing here today, and that would be Dr. Håkan Kalzén. I think he was mentioned in the program. He is the doctor and managing director for Anaesthesia and Intensive Care Unit at the Södertälje hospital. And really, it's his fault I'm here. It was in March, very late Thursday night, about almost midnight, when he called me in 2020. And he called and he said, nothing is working. Nothing is working. We don't have any standard operating procedures. We don't know what to do anymore. Our staff is already on their knees. And he said, Magda and Johan, we know that you've been working with humanitarians. We know that you've been working with journalists in conflict zones and post-conflict zones. Is there anything that you know that we could make use of? Because now it's a war zone. It could be a war coming on, and we are not prepared for this. And curiously enough, we had just teamed up with an old friend who is a military psychologist and who is just finishing his PhD at Karolinska Institutet on performance under extreme pressure. And his name is Dr. Niklas Wiesén. And we said, all right, we'll try. We'll see what we can do. And we went into the clinic 2 days later. We got dressed up in what we knew was safety gear, and we monitored. We stood in the room and we tried to listen and see what's going on. Where is the pressure coming from? What are the choking points? What can we see from our perspectives on the communication and where people are breaking down? Now, it's also his fault I'm here, not because he called us, but I guess I'm partly responsible too, because when this was all happening, we had a particularly rough day towards the end of May, and then we pitched the idea that, you know, there should be something coming. There should be a brighter future. We need to look forward to something. And so we pitched the idea that maybe we should come here and speak at a conference. Maybe we could share some of these instruments, because I think already then we knew that we needed to share an experience, and we also knew that we needed to make use of what we had learned. All these hard-earned lessons, they also need to be communicated. So that's why I'm here today, to share some of that with you. When you have a crisis, especially I learned in the healthcare industry, you look at it as one period. It's isolated. If you're talking a massive crisis, it could be a bus, it could be a car accident. It's within a scope that you can handle. It could be 2 or 3 days, perhaps. Even if you have a mass casualty, you can work really hard and then you can go home and have your recovery. Now, that wasn't really the time. We looked at this point in time, but instead we just saw it continue and continue. And this point, it turned out to be a timeline instead. It went on. We didn't know this, of course, in the beginning, but it became apparent quite soon. And this is what it looked like. We were struggling because when we didn't know how long we would need to be running and when we would have our recovery, we couldn't pace ourselves. I think that was one of the first lessons that we drew. We didn't know how long we must continue. And that was a big shift in mindset. And that was absolutely crucial for why we were invited to do what we also did. Because what happened here quite early on is that the entire unit understood that they needed to think and act differently. There were so many things in this crisis that happened and affected us all. It was, of course, what we all seen, I guess, with the massive plight of people being infected, being seriously ill, and even dying. But also there were follow-on effects of a crisis. This is what the ICU in Södertälje looked like in the beginning. We had Håkan on top. He had some of his senior doctors with him, and he had a staff, but it's a rather small hospital still. The crisis affected them because in a couple of weeks they had to grow. Now, finding qualified ICU nurses and doctors, is extremely hard. It takes years and years to gain a level of profession that to actually be able to deliver the aid that you need. But you can just imagine the challenge of both finding and recruiting staff. But the leaders, you couldn't replace them. You couldn't get people in, and this is what they were running with, and having 3 shifts. So for the staff, really this was one of our main challenges. And also it was quite different. And I must say, these pictures, I find them amazing. It was a photographer from one of our biggest Swedish daily newspapers that came in and took them. Give him some kudos. So this is one of our senior nurses at Södertälje, and she's wearing the Swedish military mask. And this whole idea of a military coming in, that it was a warlike situation, was just shocking into the Swedish identity. It was definitely a challenge. But we were having to don masks. We were having to wear protection. We were, for the first time, in a warlike situation. For many of these nurses, they are very, very civilian. Many have been, in a way, hardened because Södertälje has seen a number of shootings, but they have never had to be afraid of their own person. This was new. And also it was ongoing. It could threaten them. They could bring home the virus. So mentally, this was posing an amazing challenge to them. And that's also why we came in and said, okay, this is new, this is developing, so what can we fall back on? Well, we can fall back on a few principles. So these were the elements that we decided to work with. Resilience. Resilience in a meaning, the capacity to adapt or to change. Now that's really the key. We had to do it, and we had to do it very fast. We had to build that capacity. We also needed to look at robustness in the system. Triage, I think we know the word. We had to use that also in our organization. But robustness, finding all different parts. And this was also the key when we made the assessment, because there were so many moving parts in the organization that we needed to look at. We needed to find every part to see who was falling behind, not who was being visible in the aid that we were trying to provide. So robustness was key. But really the word that we used the most, and that comes from a military lingo, is the word stridsvärde. Now this is funny. I've tried now for a year and more to find the English equivalent of stridsvärde. But it really means to strengthen the unit and the individual's capacity to perform, both from a mental and a physiological perspective. Now this is a word that we in Sweden understand intuitively, but there is no English equivalent of it. But for us, we could use that in the hospital setting, because even though it was military, they understood that they needed both to be physically fit and mentally fit. But very importantly, it's a dual use in a sense as well, because when we started using that word, we were granting them recognition that this was new, so that they could actually also be better at adopting and applying these new concepts. Which, out in the field, yes, we knew this, but we weren't really being supported by the municipality, by the county, by the media. We were still lagging in this understanding of the situation. So stridsvärde is a new word, and I'm going to launch an English equivalent today. We'll see if it catches on. It's called function, right? So let's call it funk. What's your funk? Physically and mentally. And this is what we worked on really hard. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a theory backdrop of what we used and why. Now, it all goes back to this model of demands and resources, because it's well known within psychology and behavioral psychology that you need to balance your demands and your resources. And well, this is all great, when it's not a crisis, where you can actually impact these things. You think that in a crisis, it's just, all hands on deck and run. No, you still have to apply this. This still will affect your body. So just gaining an understanding that there is a balance and that you can impact it was hugely important. We had to draw up and make an awareness, give ourselves an awareness of where we were going with this. But this is the backdrop, the theoretical backdrop, that we have demands and resources, and they have to balance, at least over time. Also, we're going to talk both about acute and accumulated stress, but there's another model or theory that I think also is very important that we had to use, also with especially the staff when they were shell-shocked, when they were traumatized, when they just didn't manage to put on the masks and go back in because they were completely crippled by fear. It's this thing, reason versus emotion. Now, there are probably medical professionals that know exactly more about this in the backdrop and have used it, but very, very simply, it means that if you can activate the cognitive, the reason, that part of your brain, you're going to be a lot better off than if you are passive and you react with emotions when you stimulate the amygdala of the brain instead. And we do this in acute crisis, but also in a prolonged crisis. It's important that you really start acting instead of stabilizing a memory of fear. Now, understanding stress is important, both for theory, but it also helps you if you understand what's happening in your reactions. That's that's a safety feature that will help you get through it. So we really needed to squaddy-proof the science to make people understand what was happening in their bodies. Could they anticipate their emotions? So we drew this dashboard, and we tried to use it a bit like when you're driving a car, right? This is the analogy, where the first thing that you know is that in acute stress, I mean, when we're driving, we want to be cruising on green. That's good. And then when we're overtaking a car, it's okay if the meter goes up a little bit. But you go back to green, right? That's where you want to be. You want to be within the green, and then a little bit of stress, because it's not dangerous to sometimes feel pressured, to sometimes feel stress. That's fine. We function if we can recover, if we can go back on green. That's the lesson. Now, if you don't manage to go back on green, then you're going to have your yellow light. It's going to stop blinking. Tink, tink, tink. A little bit of awareness here. You might need some service. You want to be aware that you can, make sure that you get your recovery. You're still okay-ish, but you need to pay attention. If you continue pushing, if you don't manage to return, you're going to get the red light. This is a simple version, but I think you get the idea. So we used this understanding to teach the leaders and also the staff, and especially you saw the big numbers. We had all kinds of people come in. And Södertälje, there's a circus company that we used. They weren't touring, so they were helping out. They were hands and legs at the ICU. Now, this, of course, is nothing that we just came up with like that. It's based on science, and this is what we used. We used what was battle-proven and what science. And this is just to show you what Niklas has been doing for the Swedish Armed Forces. It's a little thing that you can keep in your pocket to do an assessment of your funk on the mental side. And again, it shows you how it's all right to be in the green, you're ready. Yellow, you're reacting. That's fine. This is where you want to be. Otherwise, you're feeling a bit of a pressure, and you need to make sure where you are. So there's some words that you can use to check yourself on this. Okay, so that's the theory. It's part of the toolbox that we had. But also, we needed to work with the leaders, these 8 people who were running the show. Now, on the resource side, this is what you have. We know that you need good leadership. It's extremely beneficial to have a camaraderie. If you can build in and give the people who are in this kind of pressure to the situation a sense of control, that's a resource that's extremely helpful. If you can even impact, if you have an ability to impact on events or your own situation, yes, that's a resource. Clear information, that's what we have least of in a crisis, right? But if you can provide an understanding of what's happening, that's really important. Mindset, let's not forget how crucially important it is that you have a mindset. Now, if you don't even assess the crisis, if you're going to run a sprint or a long haul, if you're still hoping to go back to normal and comparing everything to normal, you're in a really bad place. But if you have a mindset that can tackle this, you're in a much, much better place. And of course, let's not forget about this whole coping mechanisms and ability to recharge. Now, again, this is a bit of the what? The how comes into the tools. And this is what we started working with. You need to marinate an organization in the right type of information. You need to continuously share details of what is happening and what you're thinking. We very quickly started with using what I think many have but wasn't available at the ICU, which is a common operational picture. We needed to create a shared understanding of where we were going. Very simple, because there was an overload of information. But we needed that. We established a bit of an operative rhythm, because in the beginning there were just meetings that were continuing and continuing. We had if you don't have an operative rhythm, how will you then have the leadership, the control, an ability to impact? It doesn't work. And we started working on a narrative, on making the orders very clear. And I think this is interesting. Not just what, but also why. I mean, a good leader takes pride in, I said what we're going to do, and I also said why we're going to do it. If you are a straight A student, A++, you would also tell why not. We're going to add on to that. In a crisis, if you can share what your intention was, why you took a decision the way you did, and what you were hoping for, if you can invite into that space and share what we call the commander's intent, you're changing the game a bit, really. And I'll explain why. Because when they were wearing the mask, they were fighting an invisible enemy. It was popping up everywhere, it was morphing. We do have an experience that has certain similarities that we can draw on, and that's the war on terror. There has been a great development in how, especially the American military, has fought and organized. And we have seen it as part of Metis, and there's plenty of literature, if you are in that field, that you can draw from. And some of these things that were applicable, we actually did use. And this is one of the most important things. This is what you're aiming for, but it's also something that's very concrete. We call it the shared consciousness, gemensam medvetenhet. Now, it builds on three things. A truly deep and shared understanding of what the challenge is. What's the challenge? What could it lead to if you feel that in your gut, and all of you in that group organization understand that this could actually lead to failure, that we're not going to make it with these patients, something very concrete. And if you have a shared consciousness about what it demands of us to master the situation, if you work towards this, if you can have this in your organization and build a narrative on that, this will unleash a different way of organizing and working. And also, with the psychology of the brain, this will help you protect you. Because this will give you the strength and will and capacity to withstand challenges. You will have that different mindset. It will also translate into how you organize. Now, there were 8 people leading 300. You need to have empowered execution. If you can have the commander's intent, if people understand this, they can take actions in a completely different way. And also you can build team of teams. So this is what we worked on. Now, I also promised I was going to share some of the toolbox with you. I'll just show you a few pictures. These are the principles that we used, and they were very specific, responding to the situation at that particular ICU, where we had a problem with disinformation and a lot of negative talk, especially when there were breaks, and the staff needed a rest, but instead we had a toxic environment in some places. But this is what it looked like when we had a common operating picture. Again, this is dual use. I mean, we use it for information sharing, but we could also draw people away from coffee rooms when we didn't have the leaders present, where we could steer questions and flush them with the right information instead of what if, but why not? I mean, we need to address that, but we definitely need to be proactive in leading. So this is what it looked like. And also, here, this is another picture from inside the ICU, and they're taking a break, giving each other a little bit of a massage in the back. You see there's a nurse also in the back, taking a bit of a rest. So what we pushed in here, again, understanding of the stress, and very, very concrete tactical tools. Because the train had already left the station, right? We weren't able to say, well, let's all go and have a training course. Let's do a little powwow before we go out on a mission. We didn't have that. We came in as we had left the station. We just needed now to do micro trainings. So one thing that we worked on was getting these professionals to breathe. But you can't breathe into a paper bag when you're wearing a mask, or if you're talking to relatives. So we also taught other things that we know work, with tactical relaxations, finding the appropriate level of pressure, because sometimes you do need to be at a high level. So we used Cooper's colors that some of you from the military might recognize. Something very important I'd like also, just the last 2 notes here, are the daily uplifts. This is something in science that's been proven again and again, that we have daily hassles and we have daily uplifts. We shouldn't underestimate the daily uplifts because that does something to your brain. So we really try to get the operative rhythm and the daily uplifts, little welfare things. And then we brought in the firm hand. That's something that we know from the military. You know, you're pointing with the entire hand. It wasn't really done in the ICU, but we needed it at this point. And one of the most important things is that we needed to have ordered rest. Because in the ICU, you were trained to continue running. You thought it was in solidarity that you'd be working and working and working. And that wasn't true solidarity in this situation. Should I maybe open for a few questions or give you?
I think a couple of questions now. Thank you so much for that, because that's one of those presentations that's so clear and so logical and so informative that you just think, why didn't I know all this before? So thank you very much. Quick round of applause and then we'll do some questions. So are there any questions from the audience? Because I've got lots. Yes, we do. Over here, please.
Hi. Talking about ICU environment and leadership and resources for stress-reducing leadership, we're talking about combating fear. That's what we're talking about. And there is a part called science, pure science, that might convince people. And I didn't see that into the picture. We're talking about trained health professionals. So I see the good leadership, the camaraderie, the sense of control, the ability to impact, clear information. Maybe within that clear information bracket, we should put science in order to convince people with combating fear. Because you mentioned also that the ICU personnel never faced this danger. Well, within an ICU, you have microbes and bacteria that are very, very dangerous, but they get used to it, and they were not fearing those. They were fearing COVID because it was the unknown. So I think talking about this specific group, science should be added to that.
I can only agree, science needs definitely to be added to this, and I think, well, there were two factors that made it possible for us to work on this. One was that there was such a new situation that they had a willingness to change, a willingness to take us in. So that was a key element, and that was very brave from the hospital leadership. But then science came in, and I wasn't able to share all with you, but being disputed, having a PhD doctor come in and talk about the science of the brain was definitely important. And also we did apply other tools to measure the stress of the staff, which we followed on a weekly basis, which we showed them, where we had factors that we could employ. And that was part of the funk that we did, and that's part of the PhD research of Niklas. But that was the language that they needed. So thank you for lifting that. That's definitely crucial. Trust when you work on new methods.
Thank you. We've got one more question at the back, please.
Thank you for a marvelous presentation, and I will tap on Dimitri's point, because I think that science was a key issue, but what we saw in the pandemic was that there is another component which, luckily for the first time, people had to deal with moral dilemmas. We are not used, thank God, to an environment where you choose which patient will be treated and which patient will get less resources. And we found it extremely difficult, both in pre-hospital but also in the hospital setting, for people that for the first time said, we could have done more for this patient, and we didn't.
That was, we call it, we talked a lot about the moral dilemma. It was a big topic in Sweden, and it was, again, where the outside world had one picture, the politicians had one picture, and inside the clinic you had a personal experience, which was quite different. And we try to use a concept we called weaponizing ethics, where we actually used ethics to understand and to take decisions, and to have that when you don't have the standard operating procedures, where you can't fall back on a manual that gives you an okay to take these decisions. So instead, we wanted to use ethics as a way, as a compass, when you had to deal with these horrible decisions on who was to be given care and who was to be removed from the machines. Thank you for lifting that.
Thank you very much. I get the feeling this could be a whole workshop, morning, at least a workshop, couldn't it? I mean, we've learned so much, and also Scandinavian countries keep on giving us new words. It's wonderful. Thank you. I mean, I'm already taking my own personal stressometer away. Funk, though I would say stridsvärde, is far, far prettier a word. And also tactical relaxation. I love the sort of crossover, the military and so forth. So really, thank you so very, very much for your presentation.